Welcome to another episode of the 10-Minute Land Surveyor. I'm Dave Woolley. Today I'm going to talk about licensure in California. Land surveyors have been licensed in California since 1891, so they've been licensed for about 130 years. In those 130 years, they've licensed approximately 9,500 surveyors. So you're part of a very exclusive group. Currently, I believe there's about 4,200 active licenses in California. Now, that doesn't mean you have 4,200 people practicing. Of those active licenses, approximately 1,000 of those people are out of state, and you have most retirees that I know keep a license. So if I were going to estimate, I'd say there's about 2,500 practicing land surveyors in the state of California, and this is a state with 40 million people. So you are part of a very exclusive group. Let's talk about how it came to be that land surveyors were required to be licensed in 1891. Well, what happened is 1850, we had a gold rush, California became a state. The Civil War ends in 1865, they're expanding west, and the surveys, you'll find a lot of surveys starting around 1870 and going into the 1880s. So if the law passed in 1891, they probably realized they had a problem at some time in the 1880s, maybe the early mid-1880s, 1885. So they knew they had a problem. What was the problem? Well, there was fraud and there was incompetence, and apparently lots of it. When I say that, how do I know? Well, there was testimony available at the time prior to the 1891 Land Surveyors Act talking about how it was important. Some of the testimony, I'll pick this up mid-sentence. It says, these circumstances have been in many instances taken advantage of by irresponsible outside surveyors who have caused much additional confusion by their awkward work, bad judgment, and causing owners to subdivide, locate streets, and erect buildings in improper locations. S. Harrison Smith, City and County Surveyor, June 30th, 1889. Another part of the testimony, this was by a professor from Pennsylvania. It says, therefore, use the almost worthless maps, county maps, and township maps which exist, rudely run as their lines have been by irresponsible men on cheap money contracts, rapidly and carelessly platted afterwards, and finally forced together recklessly and without judgment so as to come within county lines, which are themselves utterly false and oftentimes half a mile away from their true location. There are no words which can more truthfully portray the condition of California than those above by Professor Leslie as applied to Pennsylvania. So they had a problem, and they said, we need to get these land surveyors licensed. And to show you part of the problem, or to show you the level of fraud, you can go to the first sentence of the 1891 Land Surveyors Act, and what it says there is it says, every person desiring to become a licensed land surveyor in the state must present to the State Surveyor General of this state a certificate that he is a person of good moral character. First sentence, you need some good moral character. That would indicate there was a problem. Now, the bones of today's Land Surveyors Act can be seen in that 1891 Act. They required that licensees set monuments on properties. They required them to file surveys in the recorder's office. And one of the things that was interesting is if you were a graduate of a degree of an institution, technical institution, you were required to put that on your license that you were in fact a graduate, which I would say is a good thing. So they recognized the education. So land surveyors are licensed in 1891, and the Land Surveyors Act stays in place and relatively the same until 1939. But in the interim, keep in mind that engineers were not licensed in 1891. Engineers didn't get licensed until about 1929, 30, 31. I'm not sure the actual year of the first test, but the PE Act, as we see today, was passed in 1929. What drove the PE Act to be put in place is there was a San Francisco Dam built, and it's a pretty interesting story. Especially if you're familiar with the movie Chinatown with Jack Nicholson. They're not related, but they have some common threads. So what happened was they built this dam. There was a ribbon cutting ceremony on the dam on that date, And that night, that dam broke and it washed downstream. And I remember it killed 250 migrant workers that were sleeping downstream, did a tremendous amount of property damage. And this is near Santa Paula, California. And somebody said, hey, who's responsible for this dam? Some guy. No license criteria whatsoever. So that's 1929, 1930. So now you have civil engineers being licensed, and that's not all disciplines, just strictly civil engineers. Well, now that you have licensed land surveyors and you have licensed civil engineers, are they one and the same? Do they cross practices? So in 1939, they pass a Land Surveyors Act. They redo the Land Surveyors Act, and it's the first time since 1891 of anything of consequence. So the Land Surveyors Act comes in 39, and there's an exemption for civil engineers. Civil engineers are allowed to practice land surveying as we know it. And the Record of Survey section is amended, and it reads very similar to how the Land Surveyors Act reads today, particularly Section 8762. Well, because there was simply an exemption for civil engineers, they were allowed to practice the same. So then what happened was they decided to expand the Land Surveyors Act in 1941. This is pre-war. So you always have to look at what was going on in the bigger picture. So right before the war, they passed the Land Surveyors Act that actually defined what is 8726 today. It was 8726 then, but they added all these sections that define land surveying and Land Surveyors Act. So 1941, fast forward, 1966. Land surveyors are looking to distinguish themselves and push the civil engineers out of the profession. And 1966, the California Land Surveyors Association is started. Of course, if the association was started in 1966, these talks were starting several years before. And where this came from was Sonoma, Santa Rosa areas, Sonoma County and Santa Rosa County is where this discussion started. And in these discussions, the primary purpose of the California Land Surveyors Association was to organize and push the civil engineers out. Now, how do you know this? Well, all of the Cal surveyors are available online. And if you read the early California Land Surveyors publications, they discuss this a lot. And now what was really interesting is they were trying to find other land surveyors, and they would send out letters. They would meet and they would send out letters with postage, and they would get in a car and they would drive down to Southern California with nothing more than, let's try to find some land surveyors and talk about what it is we're doing. So from 1866, in 1868, 69, the civil engineers, feeling some pressure from the land surveyors, what they did is they proposed that they made all land surveyors civil engineers, and then asked them to stay within their area of discipline, which is land surveying. And then let's just do away with the land surveyor's license altogether. And we can all be thankful they didn't take that deal. And they continued to push forward, and this was SB 1, and they realized defeat several times. Then about 1972 or so, the legislation passed, and they said that they were going to give the civil engineers a pass until 1982, and then after 1982, civil engineers that wanted to do land surveying had to be licensed as land surveyors. And so this is really getting more into modern era. And it was in the 70s and into the 80s that they decided to license other engineers or other disciplines. So then it became, rather than being an RCE, registered civil engineer, you became a PE, professional engineer. And so you wonder why the land surveyors maybe have always acted or been perceived to be a subordinate role to the civil engineers. Well, the main reason would be is the civil engineers and the land surveyors had a relationship, but if the civil engineer owned the shop and ran the show based on the civil engineering work and ran the company, if a land surveyor were to step up and say, well, wait a minute, you can't do this, or you shouldn't do that, or that's not proper practice, Well, the civil engineer only had to take so much before he says, listen, why am I paying you? I can sign these plans. And if they weren't particularly competent or strong in the suit, they wouldn't even have known the danger of it. And it probably didn't matter to them much because they continued to practice for many years. So that is, then in 1985, they passed the Land Surveyors Act, which really was a reformatting, some rewriting, and it's the Land Surveyors Act that we know and recognize today. But when you look at the Act in 39 and 41, you can see today's Land Surveyors Act in there. And that's the history of the Land Surveyors Act in California. I think it's important to understand the history of the Land Surveyors Act and licensure in California, because in many ways we are only now coming into our own. Why? Well, the pre-82 civil engineers that were allowed to practice land surveying, let's say you were 28 years old in 1982, so that means that you're 68 years old today and you're in retirement. And so land surveyors actually have their own voice now, and there's no duplicate duties or duplicate authority anymore. As they retire, land surveyors now have the full capacity to make the decisions that they need to make. This is a great time to be a licensed land surveyor in California. Understanding this history is a great part of that. Land surveyors are going to realize a lot more independence than they've ever had in their history. I think we're going to see a lot of engineering companies cutting surveying out of their programs because it doesn't really fit their business model anymore. Respect the license that you have. Understand the exclusivity that you have, and understand that you don't need to take cheap money contracts. You don't need to be subordinate to other professional disciplines, and that's a good thing. Let's put away our clown shoes, pack away our mini bikes, and live up to the authority given to us under this license. Thank you and have a nice day.